What's up, hobby friends, and welcome to my video tutorial on how to paint Asajj Ventress for Star Wars Shatterpoint. I've got the colors I've used up on the screen now, so if you want to give the video a pause, you can copy those down, and we can dive right on in. So I'm going to start with an airbrush base coat of Russian blue all over Ventress. Because the entire model's color palette is a lot of purples and blue tones, I chose to apply this base coat over a dark black primer just to help build up those initial layers. From there, I'm going to start by focusing on the skin. With a base coat of violet red and spectrum blue, I'm going to apply a nice even base coat over all of the flesh areas, taking care not to get the paint too chalky or thick. From there, I'll start with a highlight of spectrum blue. And for all of the skin tones, the colors that we're using incorporate a lot of white pigments. So you want to be careful to make sure that you dilute the paints and apply a lot of thin layers. Make sure that each layer dries before you apply the next. Otherwise, you'll end up with chalkiness and a buildup of layers that creates a thick texture over the model. From spectrum blue, I'll start to mix in progressive amounts of moonray flesh. Again, very diluted, lots of thin layers. I found that the Asajj Ventress face has a lot of phenomenal angles and undercuts, which really accentuates sort of the gaunt features of her face that made highlighting this actually pretty easy and very enjoyable. I continue highlighting by working up to pure greenish white on top of the spectrum blue and moonray flesh mix. I was more or less just playing around with a sort of pale albino skin tone, making sure that the highlights incorporated a more peachy yellow flesh tone, but maintaining sort of that blue-purple tone in the mid and shadow areas. You can see that my final highlights really do focus in on the cheekbones, the nose, and the eyebrows. To paint the eyes, I'm going to do a white dot of white sands to fill in the eyeball. And then from there, I'll go in with blue-green and paint the pupils. Interestingly enough, I think her eyes, rather than being Sith red, are a pale blue tone, which creates a bit of a very interesting look to her eyes, although they don't necessarily have the same pop or definition. You can go with a darker blue if you want, and you want to have those pupils really stand out. To paint the tattoos, I'm using amethyst blue, and with a very thin brush and diluted paint, I'm just very carefully painting in the pattern on her skin. I recommend looking up a lot of references. What I ended up using was a combination of the Clone Wars show as well as extended universe artwork to pull from, and not so much the official paint job for the model itself. Using amethyst blue as well, I'm going to start to highlight the purple robes. For the entire robed area, I want a stippled texture, and so I will be using a lot of, as you guessed it, the stippling technique to highlight the robes rather than just use traditional painting. From there, I'll work up with some Vallejo Blueberry. And you can really see the stippling action in motion. It's a little bit of a tedious process, but I think the end result's definitely worth it. And the entire process is just building up those progressive layers, adding brighter highlight tones. And because I wanted a semi-metallic reflective finish to the robes, as I was highlighting up, I tended to exaggerate my highlights, concentrating them on a lot of these sharp angles, the raised folds of the robes to really pick out those details. And almost as if I was painting non-muddle, I exaggerated the contrast between some of the brighter areas and the darker areas. You can see here in particular on the left side of her robes where it flares out, I have a brighter highlight band running across the middle where I imagine something in the environment is creating a bit of a reflection that's catching in the middle section of her robes. From here on out, the highlights I think are fairly exaggerated and really strong, and it's where I do veer away from the studio art as well as the shows. In the shows and the studio art, the robes tend to be a lot more in a mid-dark tone purple range, whereas I've gone for a very bright, metallic, reflective purple. So it's up to you whether you want to take your highlights this bright or not. If you don't, you can probably stop your highlighting here. And if you choose not to go as bright, you may want to actually exaggerate some of those shadow tones even more to have a bit more of that contrast. So you can see that as I'm working up to pure pastel blue, which is my brightest highlight on the robes, I really only concentrate this on some of the most pronounced areas. So we're looking at the top right of her thigh where it's pushing forward, it's catching most of the light, and then I'm focusing on those sharp edges where the folds pull out and you get those raised peaks. Finally, I'll go in with some diluted dark sea blue and I'll just re-blackline the creases and crevices in between the different sections of the robes. You want to be careful at this stage, be really, really neat. Thin layers and build them up to get the opaqueness you want. If you mess up, you will actually have to go back in and reapply a lot of the stippling. To paint the bandages, I'm going to start with a base coat of anthracite gray. Base coat all of the bandages, get right into the shadows and recesses, and only leave sort of that border between the bandages and the other materials in that darker light Prussian blue base. From there, I'll use gray blue to base coat the bandages, leaving the anthracite gray in the deep sort of dividing sections in between each of the strips. With gray blue, I'll start my highlighting. I apply an edge highlight on the top and the bottom to define the bandage shapes. And then as I wrap around to the sides and back, I do then fade out those highlights. You want to make sure that you're continuing your highlighting from the robes up through the bandages and the torso and into the skin. Keep your highlighting placement consistent. Otherwise you break that immersion because then you have different parts of the model receiving light from different sources and there's no continuancy there. I think what makes a really convincing model is to make sure that your placement of lights and shadows is consistent across all surfaces and all elements of the figure. Next, I'll be painting the non-metal silver, and this is on her belt as well as the lightsaber handles. So I'm going to start with a base coat of very dark brown, and I'm going to work my way through a number of highlights, and this is essentially an exercise in layering. Each progressive highlight leaves more of the previous layer showing, and you're sort of reducing your highlight placement as you increase your brightness and your values. You can see that as I'm approaching and applying my highlights, I'm applying a highlight where it's adjacent to another sharp edge or a corner, and then in particular on the tops and the bottoms because they're adjacent to the bright bandages and the bright sort of, again, semi-metallic robes. It's also receiving a bit of a reflected light on the sides and bottoms in particular. Once I hit about the mid-tone range, so this Dunkelgelb is about the middle value of my silvers, I start to really hone in on a lot of the more nuanced blends or highlights, especially in some of the larger plates in the belt. I'm treating her entire belt as a cylinder, and so I'm adding these sort of mid-tone highlight bands to suggest the idea that there is something in the environment that is creating this reflection. And again, that continuancy, it helps to match what's happening in the robes as well. And then from here, my final highlights of warm gray, pale sands, and ultimately white is continuing to reinforce the highlights that we've been applying so far. To sell a convincing reflective surface when you're painting non-metal metal, I find it's all about having that contrast. You want to make sure that you are moving from bright to mid, bright to dark, not necessarily rapidly, depending on how reflective the material is. A matte finish might have more subtle transitions, whereas something that's highly reflective like chrome may jump suddenly. But it's about having those brights and darks close together to sell that reflection or the reflective nature of whatever it is you're painting. Once you hit pale sands and then ultimately white, just make sure that you're diluting your paints and applying thin layers, allowing each layer to fully dry before applying the next. You don't want to push white paint across the model because that's how you get the clumping. And then if you over dilute or under dilute, that also contributes to your chalkiness. This is really an element where experience comes into play a lot, just familiarity with how the paint behaves and an understanding of how to approach these techniques. With the white highlighting, I use this fairly sparingly, mostly to do some edge highlighting on the top edges of the belt. I highlight some of the more pronounced bands on the side, you can see again, to match what's happening in her robes. And then I finish off with some white specular dot highlighting on the bottom corners as a bit of a sort of reflected light highlight. I think this adds a bit of pop and really helps to sell that reflective nature of the object. You can look at adjacent elements to the metal, and wherever you have a sharp edge or a corner, that's a very useful place to add this dot highlighting. To paint the tabard, I'll start with a base coat of a 50-50 mix of Tenebrous Gray and a Violet Red. And then to highlight this, I'm going to start with Violet Red, and I'll follow this up by mixing in some highlight flush into the Violet Red as well. I'm being fairly neat with the stage. I'm picking out the internal elements that will be purple, and I'm being careful not to apply this highlight onto any areas that are going to be gold. The reason for this is the neater I am now at this stage, the less correcting I have to do later on. Because of the way that the sculpt of this model is, you want to maintain that dark base tone in the recesses, and then when you get to the gold later on, you don't want to have to then go back and neaten up all of the purple. So being neat here, taking the time with the purple, saves you a lot of headache later on. The gold, much like the silver, is just an exercise in layering up your colors. The gold detailing on the tablet in particular is a lot of thin elements, so you're not really working through blending larger surface areas. You're more just creating highlights and focusing on that contrast, making sure that you have your bright highlights adjacent to some of your mid or dark shadow tones to get that jump between brights and darks that really does sell that reflective nature. One particular element I did find with the gold particularly challenging was the fact that the way it's sculpted, it's actually layered. You have some flatter elements that sit on top, and then a very thin band that encircles or encapsulates all of them. What I find a lot of people do is they just do a very simple wash on top of it, and it picks up most of the detail, but I find that if you spend the time to really highlight each of these sort of, I guess, outline bandings individually, it really does just elevate that model, and it gives it that polish that I find a simple base coat wash doesn't achieve. It does drastically increase the amount of time that you have to spend, and I will admit I probably went a little cross-eyed painting the tabard, but I do think that the end result speaks for itself. The one advantage to working on the tabard for the gold is that because there's not a lot of flat areas, your color transitions can be a lot more sudden. The jump in colors that I went through for the gold were a lot more drastic because the elements I was painting were very, very thin, and I wasn't worried about blending on a larger surface area. I could just dilute my paint a little bit and feather them out, and that helped to create that transition. To paint the lightsaber, I start with a base coat of wine red, and then from there, I'm doing a quick blend, wine red through carmine through blood red, and then we'll finish off with some highlighting with some fire flame, mixed in with some white, especially for those edge highlights. So the blend, very straightforward. It's that wine red, carmine, blood red. I start the darkest at the tip, and I start the brightest at the tip, and I work my way towards a dark tone at the base of the lightsaber. And this is more just a stylistic choice. In theory, the lightsaber should be brighter at the base or at the hilt of the blade, and then fades out as it reaches the end. If you actually watch the films, the blade itself is pure white, and the color emanates in a glow. But I've chosen this approach to painting my lightsabers because I think the end result feels much more convincing. So as an artistic choice, I've just chosen to ignore the laws of light and physics. Once I've got that blood red blend in, I start taking fire flame and mixing in progressive amounts of the AK white to start to form my highlights. So I do a bit of a pink fade at the very, very tip. And then once I've got that locked in, I go in with pure white and I apply 4 line highlights on the blade. The blade itself is a cylinder, but if you think of the blade as a rectangle with 4 corners. What I'm looking to do is apply essentially 4 edge highlights on those corners, creating a box around the blade. And so the aim here is, depending on the angle that you look at, you'll have 1 or 2 edge highlights flanking a red blended core. And I think this is really the technique or the choice that helps give the blade a much more reflective shine. I don't think it makes sense in terms of how a lightsaber should look, but I think it's the easiest way to translate a lightsaber look that feels much more polished than doing a simple bright to dark blend on the blade somewhere. What I see a lot of people do is doing a white to a color blend, either from the tip to the hilt or from the hilt to the tip, and for me that isn't very convincing. Once the blade's highlighted, I'm going to go in and start working on the OSL or object source lighting. So I'm going to start with a very thin glaze of wine red, and I'm going to airbrush this onto where I want to map out the OSL. You can do this by hand, but I think it's much easier with the airbrush to do it over a larger area. Just make sure that you do mask off where necessary on the model to avoid any overspraying. Again, much like with the actual shows and films, what really sells a lightsaber is not the actual color of the blade itself, but the source lighting. Again, those blades are white, so really it's the light that's emanating around it and reflecting off of the objects in the surrounding area that really do sell the effect. So this, I think the source lighting is critical to having a convincing lightsaber effect. To highlight the glow, I'm just using the exact same colors I used for the blade: wine red, carmine, blood red. On the tabard, I do highlight with the stippling technique just to mirror or match what I've done on the rest of the robes. And the approach is no different as if you're highlighting any other part of a model. You're just simply treating the source of the light, in this instance the lightsaber, as your new light source. So you want to apply your highlights and your shadows according to where that light source is coming from. That does mean on an existing area of the model where you've already applied those brighter or darker areas, you may have to force brighter highlights. So here what you're seeing is when I initially highlighted the robes, it was in relation to the environmental light source, but then I have a secondary light source, which is my lightsaber, and it's creating these highlights in the shadow tones. So I'm having to go in with my various red tones and I'm forcing or creating brighter highlights, both mid and bright, in those shadow tones. For the robes in particular, because I do want a semi-metallic finish, I do go stronger with the light sourcing here relative to the arm, and then especially on those peaks, I really do push out those highlights even further. You can see in the next steps that I start to incorporate some of that highlight flesh or the sunny skin tone into the fire flame to really exaggerate the sharp peaks and corners and edges on the robes. I think if you're doing the stippling texture technique on Ventress, actually doing this source lighting fade on the robes is a lot simpler because you can just stipple. You're not looking to create a smooth, perfectly blended transition. You can use stippling to suggest the fade, and from far away, the eye sort of interprets and fills in the gaps, and it interprets it as a much smoother transition than it actually is. Once that's done, I go in with some Vallejo Evil Red, which is a very rich magenta color, purplish red in tone, and I'm looking to glaze over the mid and shadow tones. Where I have shadows that are being hit in the general area of my lightsaber light source, I want to introduce a bit of that red tone into the shadows. So I do use the airbrush for this, but if you want greater control, definitely go in by hand and do more of those controlled glazes. It all just depends on how comfortable you are with the airbrush. You can definitely use both as well. The airbrush to initially apply it over a broader area, and then going back in by hand to fine-tune specific placement. My final step is to do a very light Druchii Violet glaze. This I'm targeting a lot of the shadows in the front of the model, in particular where there's no light source from the lightsaber. And this adds just a bit more of a cooler shadow tone. It deepens some of those shadows. Like I was mentioning before with the robes, I think this part becomes a lot more important if you don't take the highlighting on the robes as bright and as reflective, you'll want to go back in and exaggerate more of those shadow tones. And that'll complete Ventress. The actual base itself, I've got a tutorial for in a separate video. I will have a link in the video description below if you want to check that out, or you can base the model for the scheme of your choice. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure you like and subscribe for more awesome weekly content. If you want to check out my other social media platforms, I'll have links in the video description below. And as always, until next time, happy hobbying.